5 years? That's how long I lived in the dark. I was a king of shadows, ruling a throne that felt like a cage. My heart? It was stone. My soul? It was half alive. But then, my daughter stopped breathing. The healers called it a curse. My sister called it a tragedy. I called it a death sentence. Until I found her, Elara Vance, the woman who shattered my world and then vanished into the salt and the spray. She was the only one who could hear the stars, the only one who could pull the ice from my little girl's veins. I dragged her back to the capital in chains of desperation. I told myself I hated her. I told myself she was a traitor to our bloodline. But then, I saw her touch my daughter. At that moment, the lie burned away. She didn't leave me for ambition. She left to save my crown from a monster. Now? The queen wants her head. The void sentinels are at the door, and the stars are falling from the sky. Let them come. I am the ground. She is the sky. And I have already lost her once. She saved the Alpha King's daughter. And now, I'm never letting her go. Chapter 1. The Ice in the Garden. My daughter's laughter was the only thing that could pierce the suffocating fog of royal duty. I stood on the balcony, watching Lyra chase fireflies in the palace gardens. She looked like a tiny, glowing spark against the dark hedges. Deep down, I knew the truth. That spark was fading. The court healers called it a mystery, but because I was her father, I felt the coldness growing in her spirit. Every breath she took felt like a gift I didn't deserve. "Look, Papa! I caught a star!" Lyra giggled. She reached out her small hands toward the sky, trying to grab the shimmering starlight. Suddenly, her laughter cut off. It was as if a candle had been snuffed out by an invisible wind. Her small body stiffened and she tumbled to the grass. Without thinking, I vaulted over the stone railing. My boots hit the dirt hard, but I didn't feel the jar in my knees. "Lyra!" I roared. Before I could move, the air around her turned frigid. In the span of a breath, I was at her side. I scooped her up, and my heart skipped. Her skin wasn't just pale, it was marble cold. A thin layer of frost began to bloom across her cheeks like a winter curse. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She was a statue of my own failures. "Someone! Help her!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The palace guards scrambled, but I barely saw them. Time stood still as I pressed my ear to her chest. There was a heartbeat, but it was slow, thumping like a dying drum. Eventually, the head healer arrived, his face twisted in confusion. He waved his hands, chanting useless spells that did nothing but flicker and die. In that moment, I realized the crown's magic was hollow. What's worse, my sister Valeraine was watching from the terrace. She didn't look worried. She looked bored. To make things worse, she sipped her wine as if my daughter wasn't dying on the lawn. I felt a growl rise in my throat, a primal sound I hadn't made in years. It was as if my wolf stirred, sensing a predator in the shadows. Moments later, I carried Lyra to her chambers. I tucked the blankets around her, but the frost kept returning. As I smoothed her hair, I felt something crinkle in her silk pocket. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. It was a piece of parchment, old and worn at the edges. Truth be told, I hadn't expected to see that name again. It was a sketch of a woman standing beneath a crown of stars. The title was written in a flowing, elegant script, The Starweaver. Under the weight of his stare, the image seemed to pulse with a hidden warmth. It was Elara, the woman who had left me 5 years ago without a single word of explanation. Maybe it was fate that Lyra had found this. She didn't know what scared her more, the girl's illness or the woman who could fix it. Why would Lyra have a drawing of the woman I loved and lost? Chapter 2. The Queen's Cold Heart. The throne room felt like a tomb. I marched through the heavy oak doors, my cape snapping behind me like a whip. Valeraine sat on the high throne, her eyes sharp and predatory. She was my sister, but because of her thirst for power, we were strangers. The air thickened as I approached. I could smell the ozone of her dark magic. It smelled like wet earth and old blood. "She is dying, Valeraine," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Children get sick, Kaelen," she replied, waving a hand. "It is likely just weak blood. She never was a sturdy heir." Because of that, I slammed my fist onto the arm of her throne. The wood cracked under my strength. Not only that, but the guards shifted, their hands going to their swords. I didn't care. In fact, I wanted them to draw. I needed something to fight, something to break. "This is no fever," I hissed. "She is freezing from the inside out. The healers say the stars are being pulled from her." Valeraine laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Instead of chasing fairy tales about stars, you should focus on the border. The northern clans are restless. That is your duty." Still, I stayed my ground. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of triumph. It was as if she wanted Lyra to fade, which meant the throne would be hers alone, with no heirs to challenge her. What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like lead in my lungs. "You won't help her?" I asked. "I will not waste resources on a lost cause," she stated. Deep down, I knew the truth. My sister was the one who had cast the shadow. She wanted the pure blood legacy, and Lyra was a threat to her vision. As the silence roared, I made my choice. I wouldn't stay here and watch my daughter turn to ice. Rather, I would find the woman who knew the language of the heavens. "You're a monster," I whispered. "I am a queen," she corrected. "And you are a prince who forgets his place." As I turned to leave, I felt her stare burning into my back. Even so, I didn't look back. I had to leave the capital tonight. To make things worse, Valeraine would call it treason. She would hunt me to the ends of the earth. But then, I thought of Lyra's frozen face and the sketch in my pocket. Before the words left her lips, I knew where I was going. I was going to the Whispering Cape. I was going to find Elara Vance, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. Burning the Past. That night, the moon was a silver scythe in the sky. I moved through the secret tunnels of the palace, carrying a small pack and my old travel cloak. Shadows danced between them as I reached the hidden stables. My horse, Cinder, huffed a breath of steam, sensing my urgency. Her body moved on instinct as I saddled her in the dark. Soon after, I stopped by the fireplace in the guardroom. I pulled a small dried flower from a hidden compartment in my tunic. It was a star lily, the last gift Elara had given me before she vanished. It was a symbol of my weakness, a tether to a ghost. With a single glance, I threw it into the embers. The petals curled and blackened. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I felt a sharp ache in my chest. I believed she had left me for her own ambition. I believed she wanted the stars more than she wanted me. Yet I was the one who had stayed in a golden cage while she ran free. "No more lies," I muttered. I checked Lyra one last time. She was wrapped in furs, being carried by my most trusted servant. We would meet at the city gates. Truth be told, I was terrified. If Elara refused me, I had no plan. If she hated me as much as I hated her silence, Lyra was doomed. "Papa," Lyra whispered in her sleep. Beneath the moonlight, her voice sounded like cracking glass. She wasn't talking to me, though. Her small hand reached up, tracing patterns in the air. "The Starweaver is calling," she murmured. "I'm coming home to the lights." She didn't know what scared her more, the girl's words or the way the frost receded when she spoke them. Just like that, everything changed. I wasn't just a prince anymore. I was a man on a mission of mercy and war. I swung into the saddle and spurred Cinder into the night. With every step he took, the city fell further behind. As the sky darkened, the wind carried his name back to the palace walls. I was a traitor now, but as the bond pulsed in my blood, I knew I was finally doing my duty as a father. By the time the sun rose, I would be halfway to the sea. The Whispering Cape was a place of ghosts and salt, but it held the only light left in my world. Would Elara see the man who let her go, or the man who would burn the world to keep his daughter warm? Only the stars knew the answer. Chapter 4. The Ghost of the Whispering Cape. The salt spray stung my eyes as Cinder crested the final ridge of the Whispering Cape. Below us, the sea churned like a cauldron of molten lead, gray and unforgiving. Perched on the very edge of the jagged cliffs sat the observatory, a crumbling stone finger pointing defiantly at the heavens. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Truth be told, I wasn't ready to see her face. Not after 5 years of silence that had carved a canyon between our souls. "Stay back," I whispered to my servant, who held the shivering, fur-wrapped bundle of my daughter. I dismounted, my boots crunching on the sea-bleached pebbles. The air thickened with the scent of brine and something sharper, the ozone of concentrated starlight. Before I could move, a small shadow darted past me. It was Lyra. She had slipped from the servant's arms, her bare feet hitting the cold ground with a frantic energy I hadn't seen in weeks. "Lyra, stop!" I roared, my voice lost to the wind. But then, the heavy iron door of the observatory creaked open. A woman stepped into the light, her silhouette framed by the glow of 1,000 brass gears and glass lenses. Time stood still. Her hair was shorter, shorn to the shoulders, and her eyes were harder than the flint on the beach. Elara Vance looked at me, and just like that, everything changed. She didn't look like an ambitious scholar who had traded love for a crown of stars. She looked like a woman who had been living in a tomb. "Kaelen," she breathed, her voice a ghost of the melody that used to haunt my dreams. "She's here," Lyra giggled, collapsing at Elara's feet. "The Starweaver. She smells like the sky." What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like the ocean was pressing down on us. Elara knelt, her hands hovering over my daughter's frosted skin. Her fingers trembled, a crack in the porcelain mask of her indifference. I stepped forward, my shadow falling over them both, feeling like a predator invading a sacred space. "She is dying, Elara," I said, the bitterness in my throat tasting like ash. "And you are the only one who can hear the stars well enough to save her." Chapter 5. A War of Stars and Salt. "You shouldn't have come here," Elara hissed, her eyes snapping to mine. She stood up, pulling Lyra into the warmth of the observatory. I followed, my hand resting on the hilt of my sword as I scanned the room. It was filled with charts, sprawling maps of constellations I didn't recognize and scribbled in chalk across the floor. To make things worse, the air inside was colder than the gale outside. "I didn't have a choice," I snapped. "Valeraine has turned the palace into a graveyard. She calls this stellar consumption. She says Lyra is a lost cause." Elara let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Because it serves her. This isn't a disease, Kael. It's a theft." She moved to a massive brass telescope, her hands dancing over the dials with a grace that made my chest ache. At that moment, I realized how much I had missed her. Not only that, but the anger I'd nursed for 5 years began to feel like a lie. I had told myself she left for a better view of the stars, but the desperation in this room spoke of exile, not ambition. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why let me believe you traded me for a telescope and a map?" "Because you were a prince, Kaelen," she screamed back, turning on me with her teeth bared. "And I was a girl who couldn't give you an heir. Your sister made it very clear what would happen to your throne if you stayed with me." Between us, something cracked. The truth unraveled faster than I could process it. My sister hadn't just driven her away. She had used Elara's medical diagnosis as a blade to sever our lives. Yet, before I could speak, the room plunged into darkness. As the silence roared, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. "Kael!" Elara gasped. Lyra was standing in the center of the room, her eyes glowing with a terrifying, ethereal light. Shadows began to rise from the floorboards like ink in water, swirling around her tiny frame. Shadows danced between them, reaching out with clawed fingers. The shadows were drinking the candlelight, turning the observatory into a void. "Papa, the dark is hungry," Lyra whispered. Chapter 6. The Weight of the Crown. My body moved on instinct. I lunged for my daughter, but as fire bloomed beneath her skin, a shockwave of cold air threw me back. I hit the stone wall hard, the breath leaving my lungs in a ragged burst. Soon after, Elara was there, her hands glowing with a soft blue radiance. She was trying to ground the energy, her face pale with the effort. "The siphon is accelerating," Elara choked out. "Valeraine knows she's here. She's pulling the thread from the capital." "Then stop it," I pleaded, struggling to my feet. "Do the magic, Elara. Weave the stars." "I can't do it alone," she cried, her voice trembling. "I need an anchor. I need a physical force to hold the line while I reach for the heart star." Deep down, I knew the truth. She was asking me to be the earth to her sky. If I failed, the energy would incinerate us both. If I succeeded, I would be tied to her forever in a way that no decree or crown could ever break. Truth be told, I had never been more terrified, and I had never been more certain. "Use me," I said, stepping into the circle of shadows. What's worse, I saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for me. She reached out, her fingers lacing with mine. The moment our eyes locked, the air thickened. I felt the pulse of her magic, a rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of my own heart. In the span of a breath, the observatory vanished, replaced by a vision of the infinite cosmos. "We have to take her back," Elara whispered as the tension broke. "The ritual can only be completed at the celestial eyrie. We have to go into the heart of the Queen's power." "That's suicide," I said. "No," she replied, her soul answering mine. "It's motherhood." As the sky darkened outside, I looked at the woman I had once lost and the daughter I was terrified to lose now. I noticed Valeraine's spies watching from the cliffs through the window. Eventually, I realized that I was no longer a Prince of the Thorne line. I was a Starweaver's protector. And just like that, everything changed. Chapter 7. The Lion's Den. The carriage jolted over the cobblestones of the capital, every rattle sounding like a death knell in the silence of the cabin. I sat opposite Elara, my hand never leaving the hilt of my blade. Outside, the city was draped in mourning colors, yet there had been no official death. It was as if Valeraine was already celebrating the vacancy of the throne. Between us, Lyra lay across the velvet seat, her breathing shallow and raspy like wind through dry leaves. "She's colder than she was at the Cape," I whispered, my voice thick with a dread I couldn't mask. "Because the palace is a sinkhole for her light," Elara replied, her eyes fixed on the passing shadows of the city walls. Truth be told, I felt like a ghost returning to haunt my own house. I had spent my life defending these walls, but now they felt like the teeth of a trap. Moments later, we reached the side gate of the royal gardens, a path used by servants and spies. My heart skipped when I saw the void sentinels standing guard. They weren't men anymore. They were husks of silver armor filled with the Queen's dark smoke. "Stay behind me," I commanded, my body moving on instinct as I stepped out of the carriage. Without thinking, I used my height to shield them both. The tension broke when the lead sentinel tilted its helmet, a low hiss escaping the visor. I felt the pulse of the earth beneath my boots, my magnetic presence flaring like a warning. If they touched her, I would tear the stone from the ground to bury them. "Prince Kaelen," the thing rasped. "The Queen expects you, but the guest is forbidden." "I am the prince of this bloodline," I roared, stepping into the creature's space until our chest plates clanked. "And if you bar my path while my daughter suffers, I will show you why the Thorne line was forged in dragonfire." As the silence stretched, the sentinel stepped back. It was as if fate demanded it. We slipped into the shadows of the servants' wing, moving like thieves through the home I had once ruled. Yet the air in the hallways was different. It smelled of ozone and rot, a physical weight that made my lungs ache. Chapter 8. The Erased Legacy. We reached the guest wing, a dusty corner of the palace where the sunlight never quite reached. I barred the door, my pulse racing as I watched Elara immediately begin to draw a circle of protection around Lyra's bed. She didn't use chalk. She used a vial of starlight she had brought from the Cape. Not only that, but she was muttering under her breath, a rhythmic chant that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Kyle, look at the walls," she said, her voice trembling. I turned, and my breath caught. This wing used to be covered in tapestries of the great constellations. Now they are gone. In their place were void maps, dark swirling ink that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The heart star symbols had been scrubbed away, replaced by the empty black of the Queen's new order. "She's erasing the blueprints of the soul," Elara whispered. "If she removes the maps, the stars have no way to find their way back into the people. That's why Lyra is fading." Because of that, I felt a surge of protective fury. I looked at Elara, and for a moment the space between us burned. She was no longer just the woman I loved. She was the only map left in a world gone dark. What's worse, I realized I had been a pawn in Valoraine's game for 5 years, believing the lie that Elara was the one who was hollow. "I'll find the old charts," I said, my resolve hardening. "The archives beneath the library still hold the original Starweaver records. I'll get them for you." "The Void Sentinels will be everywhere, Kael," she warned, reaching out to touch my hand. The moment our eyes locked, I felt the stellar bond pulse. It was a physical tug, like a string tied to my heart. Truth be told, I didn't care about the danger. I only cared about the warmth of her fingers against mine. In that moment, I realized that being a prince was a cage, but being her shield was a choice. Chapter 9. The Library of Shadows. The archives were a labyrinth of cold stone and forgotten whispers. I moved through the stacks, my boots silent on the damp floor. I felt like a predator in the dark, my senses heightened by the proximity of the void. Suddenly, I heard the clank of armor. 2 sentinels were patrolling the restricted section, their red eyes glowing in the gloom. "Where are the Weaver's charts?" I hissed to myself, my thoughts spinning. I didn't have time for a search. I closed my eyes and reached for the earth. As if pulled by a string, I felt a vibration in the floor, a hidden chamber beneath the flagstones. I used my magnetic presence to lift the heavy stone lid. Inside lay a leather-bound folio, smelling of old parchment and starlight. "Found you," I muttered. But then, the air thickened. The shadows on the wall began to lengthen, detaching themselves from the stone. Before I could move, a voice echoed through the chamber, cold, regal, and full of jagged edges. It was Valorine. She wasn't physically there, but her voidcraft was everywhere. "You always were a sentimental fool, brother," the shadows whispered. "You bring the barren witch into my house to save a spark that is already dead?" "She isn't dead," I roared, swinging my sword through the darkness. "She is a battery, Kaelen," Valorine mocked, "and when she is empty, I will be eternal. The Starweaver cannot save her. She can only join her in the dark." Without warning, the library shelves began to collapse. To make things worse, the exit was sealed by a wall of black fire. I clutched the charts to my chest, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the roaring silence. I was trapped in the belly of the beast, and Elara was alone with a dying child. Eventually, I saw a flicker of light from the charts in my hand. They were reacting to my presence. The ink began to glow with a brilliant white heat. As her name left my lips, the darkness recoiled. I realized then that the stars weren't just in the sky. They were in the truth. And the truth was that Valorine had already lost. Chapter 10. The Eclipse of the Heart. The air in the guest wing didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt hungry. I burst through the doors, my lungs burning from the dash through the smoke-filled archives. Elara was hovering over Lyra, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain the silver circle of starlight. But then, I saw the window. The moon was beginning to slide across the face of the sun, a jagged black bite taken out of the sky. "Kael, the charts!" Elara cried, her voice thin and desperate. I threw the glowing leather folio onto the bed. Truth be told, I felt like a man watching his world crumble in real time. The moment the ancient parchment touched Lyra's skin, a pulse of white light threw us both back. To make things worse, the shadows in the room didn't retreat. Rather, they grew taller, fed by the unnatural darkness of the solar eclipse. "It's not working," I choked out, crawling back to the bedside. "Because the Queen is the anchor," Elara screamed over the rising wind. "She's tied her own heartbeat to the girls. As the moon hides the sun, Valeraine is hiding Lyra's soul." Without warning, Lyra's body arched off the mattress. Her eyes snapped open, but they weren't gray anymore. They were solid, terrifying voids of black ink. In that moment, the palace itself groaned, the stone walls cracking as if the building were a rib cage being crushed by an invisible giant. Chapter 11. The Shattered Mirror. "Valeraine!" I roared, my fury finally snapping the last of my royal restraint. I turned on Elara, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. The tension broke as I grabbed her shoulders, my eyes searching hers for a truth I had ignored for 5 years. Not only that, but I saw the old wound in her gaze, the secret she had carried like a lead weight in her soul. "Tell me why you really left," I demanded, the space between us burning with the heat of 1,000 unspoken words. "Don't tell me about the stars. Tell me about the Queen." As the silence stretched, Elara's face crumbled. She didn't look like a Starweaver anymore. She looked like the girl I had loved in the gardens. Her body moved on instinct, pulling away from my touch as if the truth were too hot to hold. "She told me I was a hollow vessel, Kael," she sobbed. "She showed me the medical scrolls. She told me that if I stayed, I would be the reason the Thorne line ended. She said you would be deposed, or worse, that the people would rise up against a barren princess. I left to save your crown." What followed was a revelation that felt like a blade to my gut. I had spent 5 years hating her for her ambition, when all along, she had been a martyr for a throne I never even wanted. In fact, I would have burned the crown to ash just to keep her by my side. Because of that, my magnetic presence flared, the metal ornaments in the room rattling as my power reacted to my grief. "I didn't want the crown, Elara," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I wanted you." Chapter 12. The Void's Masterpiece. Before either could speak, the room exploded in a shockwave of dark energy. Lyra went limp, her skin turning the color of wood ash. What's worse, the eclipse had reached its totality. Outside, the world was a bruised purple, and the Void Sentinels began to howl in the hallways. "She's gone," I gasped, reaching for Lyra's pulse. "I can't feel her heart, Elara." "She's not gone. She's being pulled into the Eyrie," Elara said, her soul answering my terror with a sudden icy clarity. She pointed to the sky, where a bridge of black starlight was forming between the palace and the highest mountain peak. It was as if fate demanded a final sacrifice. Valeraine's voice echoed through the chamber, no longer a whisper but a roar that shook the foundations of the city. "The bloodline is mine!" the Queen screamed from the darkness. "The Starweaver is a witch, and the prince is a traitor. Guards, bring me their heads." Soon after, the heavy oak doors splintered. A dozen sentinels poured in, their silver armor dripping with black slime. Truth be told, I knew we couldn't win this fight here. We were in her territory, surrounded by her walls and her lies. "We have to go to the Eyrie," Elara said, grabbing the ancient charts. "It's the only place where the veil is thin enough to break her hold." "Then we fight our way out," I said, drawing my sword. As her wolf stirred, I felt a change in Elara. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was a mother who was ready to tear the sky down to save her child. I stood at her side, the earth to her sky, and for the first time in 5 years, the Thorne line wasn't about a crown, it was about survival. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't running from the past anymore. We were charging into the future. Chapter 13. The Forbidden Vow. The palace halls were a gauntlet of silver and shadow. I held Lyra tightly against my chest, her weight feeling like a stone that was slowly turning to ice. Elara ran beside me, her hands glowing with a frantic, pulsing starlight that acted as our only lantern in the suffocating dark of the eclipse. Every step we took felt like a betrayal of the throne I had spent my life defending. Truth be told, I didn't care if the crown shattered into 1,000 pieces as long as my daughter breathed again. "Kael, the east gate is blocked," Elara cried, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Then we go through the glass," I roared, my body moving on instinct. I didn't stop to think. I lowered my shoulder and smashed through the stained glass window of the royal gallery. Shards of colored glass rained down like frozen tears, cutting into my skin, but I didn't feel the sting. What followed was a drop into the rose gardens, the scent of crushed petals mixing with the metallic tang of ozone. Before I could move, a wall of void sentinels materialized from the mist, their hollow armor hissing with the queen's malice. "You go," I hissed, thrusting Lyra into Elara's arms. "Get to the horses. I'll hold the line." "Kael, no, you can't fight them all," she screamed, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "I'm not fighting them as a prince," I said, my magnetic presence flaring until the iron gates of the garden began to groan and twist. "I'm fighting them as your ground. Now run." Chapter 14. The Bridge of Bone. The sentinels lunged, a blur of silver and cold fury. I planted my feet, reaching deep into the earth until I felt the iron veins of the mountain itself. Not only that, but I felt the stars above, even through the black shroud of the eclipse. I ripped the heavy iron railings from the stone, spinning them into a whirlwind of jagged metal that shredded the first wave of husks. "Is this all you have, Valeraine?" I bellowed at the sky. To make things worse, the ground began to liquefy beneath me, turning into a black sludge that tried to pull me into the dark. Even so, I didn't falter. I was a thorn, and my blood was the anchor for the woman I loved. Moments later, I heard the frantic beat of hooves. Elara had reached the stables. She was out. "Kael, now!" Her voice drifted back, a lifeline in the roaring silence. I didn't think, I just moved. I threw the last of my energy into a kinetic blast that cleared a path through the roses. My heart skipped as I vaulted onto the back of my horse, Cinder, who was rearing in terror. As if pulled by a string, we galloped toward the city gates, the stone walls crumbling behind us as Valeraine's rage tore the palace apart. "We have to reach the Eyrie before the moon passes," Elara shouted over the wind. "If the light returns before the bond is set, Lyra's soul will be locked in the void forever." Chapter 15. The Starbinding Sacrifice. The trail up the mountain was a jagged spine of granite and ice. As the sky darkened further, the air became so thin it felt like breathing needles. We stopped at the base of the final ascent, the great Eyrie looming above us like a crown of thorns. Elara pulled the ancient charts from her bag, her fingers tracing the glowing lines of the star-binding ritual. "Kael, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling with a vulnerability that broke my heart. "The ritual, it requires more than just magic. It requires a conduit. You have to be the ground, but the energy will pass through your very soul. It might burn you out." "I'm already a ghost, Elara," I whispered, reaching out to cup her face. "I've been half alive for 5 years. If this burns me, let it be the first time I've felt warm since you left." Between us, something cracked. It wasn't the mountain, but the last of the walls I had built around my heart. I realized then that my duty wasn't to a kingdom or a crown. Because of that, my soul answered her call. I was the earth, and she was the sky, and together we were the only thing that could stand against the dark. "I love you," she whispered, her breath catching. "Then use me," I said, my resolve hardening. "Bring our daughter back." Without warning, the mountain began to shake. A growl rose in the earth, and I saw the first of the black constellations appearing in the valley below. Valeraine was coming. She wasn't sending her guards this time, she was coming as the void itself. What followed was a race against a goddess. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't just running for our lives anymore. We were running toward a ritual that would either make us a family or ash on the wind. Chapter 16. The Gravity of the Void. The summit of the celestial eyrie was a jagged tooth of rock biting into a sky that had turned oily and starless. We were only yards from the ritual stone, yet the air suddenly turned to lead. My boots felt like they were cast in iron, pulling me down toward the frozen granite. I looked at Elara, her face a mask of agony as she tried to shield Lyra from the invisible pressure. Without warning, a shadow detached itself from the mountain's peak, expanding until it swallowed the horizon. You think a disgraced scholar and a broken prince can outrun the night? Valeraine's voice didn't come from her throat. It vibrated through my very marrow. What's worse, the queen didn't arrive with a crown. She arrived as a towering pillar of voidcraft, her silhouette a jagged hole in reality where the stars should have been. She raised a hand, and just like that, everything changed. A wave of zero gravity slammed into us, lifting me off my feet and tossing me toward the cliff's edge. I clawed at the air, my magnetic presence finding nothing to grip in the vacuum she had created. "Kael!" Elara screamed, her voice sounding thin and distant, as if she were speaking through water. I hit a shelf of ice, the impact rattling my teeth. Still, I forced myself to look up. Valeraine was hovering over Elara, her fingers trailing black smoke that settled over Lyra's face like a funeral shroud. Because of that, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear but from the sudden, terrifying silence emanating from my daughter. "The spark is out, brother," Valeraine mocked. "You brought her here to watch her turn to ash." Chapter 17. The Dark Night of the Soul. I tried to stand, but the black constellations above us began to pulse, pinning me to the ground. It felt like the weight of the entire Thorne lineage was crushing my chest. I looked at my hands, the hands of a man who had let his lover flee, who had married for duty and who had failed to protect the only light in his life. Truth be told, I felt like the hollow vessel Valeraine had always claimed I was. "Is this my legacy?" I choked out, the salt of my own tears freezing on my skin. "To be the anchor for a world that only wants to sink?" Next, I saw Elara fall. She wasn't being pushed by magic. She was collapsing under the weight of her own void of worth. She reached for her star charts, but the parchment was black, the ink extinguished by the queen's presence. What followed was a silence so absolute, it felt like the end of time. I watched Lyra's chest. It didn't move. "She's gone," Elara whispered, her soul breaking in a ragged sob. "I'm not a weaver. I'm just a woman who counts dead stars." To make things worse, I realized my sister was right. My magnetic gift was just a heavy, grounding force, a weight that kept us trapped in the dirt while the stars stayed out of reach. In that moment, the space between us burned with a cold, dead light. I closed my eyes, ready to let the mountain take me. Chapter 18. The Anchor's Defiance. But then, I felt it. A faint, rhythmic thrumming beneath the ice. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the pulse of the mountain, the iron blood of the earth answering the void. As the wind shifted, I remembered the way Elara had looked at the cape, tracing the charts I had once thought were just cold data. They weren't just maps of the sky. They were maps of us. "No!" I growled, my voice low and rasping. I dug my fingers into the frozen rock, my bones groaning as I forced my body to move against the queen's gravity. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just a father's rage. But I realized that holding your ground wasn't about being a prince. It was about being the one who refused to let go when the world went dark. Rather than fighting the void, I began to draw it into myself, using my magnetic presence to act as a lightning rod for the darkness. Elara, look at me! I roared, the air around me beginning to crackle with blue static. She looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Without thinking, I reached out my hand. Our fingers licked together, and the moment our eyes locked, the air thickened. I wasn't just a weight anymore. I was a foundation. I wasn't half alive. I was the only thing keeping the world from drifting away. I am the ground, I screamed at the black sky. And you are the sky. Weave it, Elara. Weave life back into her. Between us, something cracked. It wasn't the rock, but the curse itself. As her wolf stirred, Elara's eyes flared with a sudden, brilliant silver light. Even so, the queen lunged, her shadow claws reaching for my throat. But she was too late. Beneath the moonlight, a single tiny spark began to glow in the center of Lyra's chest. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't defeated. We were just waiting for the dark to show us where the light was hidden. Chapter 19. The Great Conjunction. The horizon didn't just brighten, it fractured. Above the swirling chaos of Valoraine's void, the planets began their slow, rhythmic dance into a single blinding line of silver. I felt the mountain groan beneath my boots, a deep tectonic vibration that rattled my very teeth. In that moment, the Great Conjunction I had seen in Elara's dusty charts became a physical weight, a celestial hammer ready to strike the anvil of the earth. Elara! The alignment! I roared, my voice barely audible over the screaming wind. She looked up, and for a heartbeat, her terror vanished, replaced by the cold, precise brilliance of the scientist I had first loved. What followed was a transformation as raw as a wolf's shift. She didn't just see the light, she calculated its trajectory, her fingers moving in the air as if plucking invisible strings. Because of that, the black shroud Valaraine had cast began to fray at the edges, pierced by needles of pure, ancient starlight. "It's a map, Kael!" she screamed, her eyes wide with a sudden, frantic hope. The charts weren't just for the ritual, they were the coordinates for this exact second. Still, Valaraine wasn't finished. She lunged, her shadow form twisting into a cyclone of obsidian glass that threatened to shred us both. But then, I planted my heels into the granite, reaching out to the iron core of the Eyrie. I wasn't just a prince anymore, I was a lightning rod. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I channeled the planet's alignment through my own marrow, creating a magnetic shield that pulsed with a rhythmic blue hum. "You will not touch them!" I bellowed, my magnetic presence flaring until the air smelled of scorched ozone. Chapter 20. The Ascent of Light. We began the final push toward the ritual stone at the very peak. Every step felt like wading through deep water, the void craft pushing against us with a desperate, dying strength. I carried Lyra in one arm, her body still marble cold, while my other hand stayed locked with Elara's. Truth be told, I could feel Elara's magic bleeding into me, a searing heat that made my veins glow white. "Just a few more yards," I wheezed, my lungs screaming for air that was too thin to breathe. Next, a bolt of black lightning struck the path ahead, shattering the stone into 1,000 jagged shards. To make things worse, Valaraine appeared in the gap, her face a twisted mask of regal fury. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was a hungry hole in the universe, a vacuum that wanted to swallow every memory of the light. "You would die for a child that isn't even hers?" Valaraine hissed, the sound like dry leaves on a grave. "I would die for the family we chose," I answered, my soul answering her malice with a defiant roar. In the span of a breath, I threw the last of my grounding energy forward. It wasn't an attack, it was a bridge. I forced the mountain to hold steady, creating a path of solid, unmoving rock through the Queen's chaos. Rather than retreating, Elara stepped forward, her voice rising in a celestial chant that made the very stars tremble in their spheres. Chapter 21. The Threshold of the Heart Star. We reached the ritual stone, an ancient slab of obsidian that sat at the highest point of the world. As the sky darkened to its deepest indigo, the Heart Star finally moved into position, hovering directly above us like a burning eye. The tension broke when Elara placed Lyra on the cold stone. Without another word, she looked at me, her eyes reflecting the infinite cosmos. "Kael, I need everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Every memory of us, every spark of love you've ever felt for her. I need to use it as the thread." "Take it," I said, opening my mind and heart until there were no secrets left. I felt her reach in. She saw the garden where we first met. She saw the night she left and the 5 years of gray misery I had endured. More importantly, she saw the moment I first held Lyra and realized that blood didn't make a father. Love did. Between us, something cracked, and a pillar of white fire erupted from the ritual stone, shooting straight into the heart of the conjunction. "Now!" Elara screamed. Beneath the moonlight, the shadows of the void sentinels began to evaporate, turned to steam by the sheer heat of our unified resolve. Valeraine let out a shriek of primal agony as the Heart Star began its descent, a falling diamond that promised to either heal the world or incinerate the mountain. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't just two broken people on a mountain anymore. We were the bridge between the earth and the heavens. Chapter 22. The Heart Star's Descent. The summit didn't just glow, it became a sun. I felt the Heart Star touch the atmosphere, a screaming diamond of white heat that made the very air turn to liquid gold. My body moved on instinct, my feet bracing against the ritual stone as the energy began to pour through me. I wasn't just a man anymore, I was a bridge of bone and iron, anchoring the heavens to the earth. "Kael, hold on." Elara's voice was a silver thread in the roaring gale of light. She stood over Lyra, her hands woven into the falling starlight, pulling the essence of the Heart Star down toward our daughter's chest. Because of that, the void began to scream. Valeraine lunged one last time, a jagged claw of darkness reaching for Elara's throat. But then I reached out with my free hand, my magnetic presence seizing the Queen's very essence. "You are nothing but a shadow, Valeraine," I roared, the light blinding me. "And shadows cannot survive the dawn." In the span of a breath, I channeled the white-hot energy of the conjunction directly into the Queen's heart. She didn't bleed. She shattered like black glass in a furnace. Her void craft evaporated, turning into harmless gray mist that the mountain wind carried away. As the silence roared, I felt the final pulse of the star pass through me and into Lyra. Chapter 23. The Eternal Bond. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the summit in a bruised purple twilight. I collapsed to my knees, my lungs burning and my skin humming with the aftershocks of the ritual. I looked at my hands. They were scarred with silver lines, a permanent map of the stars I had carried. Still, I didn't care about the pain. I only cared about the small, still form on the obsidian slab. "Lyra?" I wheezed, my voice a broken whisper. Elara was already there, pulling the girl into her arms. Truth be told, I was terrified to breathe. What followed was a moment where time itself seemed to stop. Then, Lyra's chest heaved. She took a long, gasping breath of the cold mountain air, her eyes snapping open. They weren't black or gray anymore, they were a brilliant, shimmering violet. "Papa?" she murmured, her voice warm and full of life. "The stars. They're inside me now." I crawled to them, wrapping my arms around both Elara and Lyra. The space between us burned with a different kind of heat now, the heat of a family that had walked through hell and come out whole. Not only that, but I felt a peace I hadn't known in 5 years. The void of worth was gone. I wasn't a hollow prince. I was a father. Chapter 24. The New Equilibrium. Come morning, the capital looked different from the balcony of the Whispering Cape. We hadn't returned to the throne room. Instead, I had abdicated, leaving the crown to a council of scholars and healers. I stood with Elara, watching the first group of young Starweavers arrive at the gates of our new school. The observatory was no longer a tomb. It was a lighthouse. "You're sure you don't miss the palace?" Elara asked, leaning her head against my shoulder. I never liked the drafty halls, I joked, my voice low and conversational. Besides, I have a better view here. Deep down, I knew the truth. Duty was a cage, but love was the sky. Lyra ran past us, chasing a butterfly with a speed that proved the stellar consumption was a distant memory. She stopped at the edge of the cliff, pointing toward the mother constellation that Elara had taught her to find. Will I be a Starweaver too, Mama? Lyra asked, looking up at Elara with wonder. You already are, my love, Elara replied, her soul answering the girl's spark. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and blooming star lilies, I realized that I had finally answered my core question. I had protected the thing I loved most by letting go of the lie I was born into. Beneath the sunlight, I wasn't a rigid sovereign or a guilt-ridden ghost. I was just a man, standing with his family, watching the stars fade into a bright, hopeful day. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living. Epilogue scene. 1 year later, the trio stands on the balcony of the Whispering Cape, which has been restored as a school for young Starweavers. As Elara teaches Lyra how to find the mother constellation in the sky, Kael watches them, and Elara realizes that while she didn't give Lyra life, she helped her keep it, and that is the truest magic of all.